Hello, welcome to the 6th Wheel of Time diary covering the 5th book of the series, The Fires of Heaven. Because this is the 6th week covering the book, and I am so very close to finished, I believe only about 80 pages left in my hardcover. Just like I wanted, this series on The Fires of Heaven is only going to be 7 episodes rather than 8 like the Shadow Rising was. So that's always nice, even though 6 would have been even better. I guess technically I could have been able to meet it so that this 6th week would have finished the book as well, but I didn't want to push things too far, and I had something else that I really needed to complete first, and which I have now. So things are going pretty good in all of my reading, not just for the Fires of Heaven. But speaking of the Fires of Heaven specifically, since that is the topic of today's video, I read 10 chapters this week, chapters 41 through 50. Some pretty big stuff in the reading this week. It took me about 8 hours to get through, actually, so beating my previous highest amount of reading for any given week for this book. I beat it by like 2 hours, so I spent quite a bit of time reading. I wanted to push through and make sure that I could absolutely get this done in 7 weeks rather than a full 8. And it worked out. Like I said, 10 chapters, chapters 41 through 50. We got to see essentially the climax of one plot line. Not a whole lot that actually kind of went down in that plot line, all things considered, but it was enough to keep me going throughout the book. I enjoyed it a lot. I really enjoyed what was in there, but it seems like it's wrapped up and resolved as it needs to be for this book, and leaves off on a note that I'm rather excited to pick up on for Lord of Chaos. And then the other plotline, we got to see some climactic moments, a couple climactic sequences, like an entire what could probably be considered the climax of the book. I mean, maybe it's not, because there's still 80 pages left, and if I know anything about Robert Jordan, it's that he's going to pack a little mini climax into the very end of the book, like the last 10 or 15 pages, just out of nowhere. So we'll see what happens in my reading for next week. But yeah, I did get through those 10 chapters just through 2 plot lines, essentially, seeing a couple of them converge a little bit, and then seeing another one go through some pretty big changes. I guess that's all that I really need to talk about for spoiler free. I enjoyed what I read quite a bit. It's keeping the Fires of Heaven pretty close to on top with Dragon Reborn. This may or may not be my favorite book in the series. We'll see how it actually ends. But the first 6 chapters of my reading this week, chapters 41 through 46, were all Rand and Matt's plotline. And this time, saying Rand and Matt's plotline is rather accurate. In case you couldn't tell, this is now the spoiler section, so, if you haven't read through chapter 50, you should probably click off now. Either way, I really enjoyed what I read from this plotline this go around. There were some pretty big events, such as a couple chapters preparing more or less for the battle with Kaladin and the Shido going underway, preparing a tower for Rand and the girls, so that'd be Avienda and Egwene, to be able to use the one power to kind of act as like a supplemental force of battle in the war, essentially, to be able to act from afar and be able to control the weather for the girls, and just be able to use one power to wreak some havoc against the Shido in the battle. So that was kind of happening in chapter 41, just preparing for some of that, getting a tower constructed for it, getting that kind of stuff taken care of. Chapter 42 was taking a step back and coming back into Matt's POV more fully, I would say, than I think we've had up to this point, like really expanding what he is, because up to this point, like, I feel like Jordan's been rather wishy-washy with what Matt is, who Matt is, and like what he kind of does besides just having his general like gambling, like dice and card habits with people. This chapter really kind of settled into a better idea of what Matt actually is as a person, and that being kind of a natural leader in the course of battle. We get to see some of Matt's, essentially, like his military strategic capabilities, what he's able to do in chapter 42 by looking at a map of just everything set up with positions, essentially, of like all the Shido and where Matt's and Rand's, where Rand's forces and like where everybody's going to be in the battle, and like what people are going to do where. And like after just staring at this map for just a few minutes, Matt is able to give a pretty solid rundown of exactly what everybody else, what all the clan chiefs were already planning to do, had already come up with the plan to do, but had taken like a lot longer to get there. Matt just like naturally knew that that's kind of what needed to happen because of his memories of the past. I'm not sure if we know exactly who Matt's like reference point is, like who his memories of the past are from, the way that Rand's are from Luce Theron. Maybe that's been revealed up to this point, maybe it hasn't, but Rand does have memories of the past. Obviously a strong military leader, whoever that may be. This comes across in chapter 42 very well as a little bit later. Chapter 43 comes back to Rand's POV. I think it might be both Rand and Matt in this chapter, because I say guess plans have changed on both fronts. On the one hand, Rand and Aviendha and Egwene are using the one power from the tower like they were preparing to do just a couple chapters earlier, brewing a little bit of early chaos in the battle. Like this is when the siege essentially begins against Kaladin and the Shido. And then the POV, that's basically all that Rand gets in this chapter. But Matt's POV is a little bit bigger, a little bit more momentous. He tries to escape. He tells Rand at the end of chapter 42, actually, like, I'm leaving, like, I'm done. This isn't for me. I'm not going to stay here anymore. So in chapter 43, he tries to leave. He tries to escape, but is basically unable to because of the countering Aiel forces, like kind of force him into like they kind of like pigeonhole him into a different path so that he has to like get away from them, which makes him confront with some of the other forces of Rand's Aiel and some other people. Actually, scratch that, Matt doesn't come to meet Rand's Aiel in the field. What he's forced into is where the Terran folk and the Carianan folk are basically marching to go into their area of battle. But because Matt was able to get a look at kind of where some of the enemy Aiel are positioned and everything, he's like able to give advice, more of this military strategy advice to these other armies, and like sort of lead them in a way to like reduce casualties and like keep them from being jumped, instead using them to be able to jump the Aiel instead. So like, you know, some really cool military strategy, again, just stuff like that happening. He ends up basically in charge of this folk, this group of people, for the rest of the battle, no matter how hard he tries or how much he wants to escape this this role for himself in the battle. He ends up leading people in the entire thing, stopping ambushes instead of leading ambushes, all this kind of thing, some fun stuff. And then we move into chapter 44, which was a pretty big chapter. Like one of the main events of chapter 44, is actually of Samael himself, the Forsaken, like kind of seemingly like on the outskirts of the battle. Maybe he's doing this from far away. We don't exactly know. It's not entirely clear, I don't think, where he is. But he is participating in the battle externally, using the one power to knock over the tower that Egwene and Aviendha and Rand are in, and this also kills some of the other maidens in the process. So like there's a whole big thing here. This is several hours into the battle when Rand and everybody are all just really exhausted, especially from using the one power so bad. Some, you know, pretty strategic moves here, but a lot of the battle takes, a lot of the tone of the battle takes a much darker turn at this point because of just how exhausted Rand is, the fact that people die from this tower collapsing, including people Rand recognizes. And we get like a sort of sense of defeat, like not actual defeat, but like a sense that like there is a feeling of defeat in the air, even though there's actually not, because even though he's like delirious and whatnot, Rand, we learn through Rand that the attack has basically completed. Maybe Samael used his, you know, power to knock over the tower in a last-ditch effort to maybe try to hurt Rand a bit after losing the battle with the Shido, if he was like influencing that to any degree. I don't know if he was. Maybe there's a little bit of suggestion there. Not entirely sure. But we learn that basically this siege against the Shido is successful. The Shido are broken, even though a lot of them, you know, kind of escaped. So Rand finally relinquishes the one power and collapses in, you know, his exhaustion from the entire day. Like just really, this chapter was tense. Like there's not like a whole lot to explain what happened and what I think happened. It's pretty straightforward, really, but it was really tense. I can't say too much more than that. It was just fun to read, especially in Rand's exhaustion, particularly the kind of going back and forth between Rand and the way that he talks to himself versus the thoughts that are like loose Theron's. It's just some really interesting material all along there. And then after that, probably the cooler part of the chapter, in my opinion, goes back to Matt's POV again, just kind of going back and forth between these two. Matt has continued to lead sieges or lead ambushes with the Terran and Carrion and folk, keeping them as safe as he possibly can, being able to keep them from being jumped by the enemy Aiel forces, which is always fun. But the more important point to be made in this chapter is that setup for a pretty momentous occasion is done, in that Matt is told by some of the other scouts from some of the other people that, like, Kaladin has Aiel coming right towards them. Like, maybe they're going to go right through them to try to find Rand, but like Kaladin is at the head of a group of an army for this battle, and like there's no way to get around them. They need to do something about it. So Matt basically gets people set up to kind of do this skirmish with Kaladin, which I was really excited for. And this is ultimately the one thing about this book that I think like I actively dislike, and that I'm not entirely sure like was a good decision on Jordan's part, because chapter 45 starts and like you're expecting this to be the start of, like I said, a skirmish between Kaladin and Matt, and it turns out that entire duel was just off the page. It just doesn't happen on the page for some reason. It's hinted at a little bit, so you like get a very tiny bit of the idea of like what happened, but like not really. You don't get to see the battle itself, and I was a little bit disappointed by this, I will admit. I wanted to see this battle, and what good could have been done through keeping something like this off the page, through leaving it to the imagination, I think was not effective in this circumstance, because it was Matt's skirmish with Kaladin. I don't think this made sense, because building up Matt's character in the way that these last couple chapters have, through this, you know, growing to be a military strategist and leader, I think it would have done a lot of good for Matt's character to actually have that battle on the page and like actually go through Matt's thought process while acting out all of that material. Whereas with Rand, if it was Rand's duel with Kaladin, for example, if this was a skirmish between those two to the death, like I could understand having it be off page, and if executed correctly could actually be like the better way to do it, for example, because after the last 4 books, I guess, but especially books 1 through 3, like we've had a lot of like Rand having climactic battles with his enemies, essentially, and like you don't necessarily need to have another one of those with Kaladin in this moment. But because it was Matt's duel with him, I don't think it actually made very much sense to not include the battle on page. It's like the one thing, like I said, about the book that I am pretty disappointed by, that I really wish I got to see. But even so, I did really like all the interactions and internal character work with Matt, in spite of the battle not being on page, being seen as a leader for both the Terrans and the Carianans, who like don't really like each other, but both like Matt, so like they're willing to work together for the purposes of this thing that they have with Rand, or with Matt now. And then also kind of like similar things happening for Rand, being in good political positioning with various groups of people now, not just the Carianan folk, but also with the Terrans, because he was already basically like the king of Tyr, essentially, and he was the reason that the Terrans were in Carrion in the first place. So like there was some pretty fun political jargon going on there. So even though like there are some loose ends after this battle, there's still some Shido alive. Kaladin is dead, so like the main opposition to he who comes with the dawn is dead. So like there's now a new goal to be set forth, something new to do with Lord of Chaos, which I'm not sure if I could predict what that might be, because the battle with Kaladin was what this book was basically leading towards. Maybe the last 80 pages will tell me what I might be looking forward to with Lord of Chaos. We shall see. And then, of course, chapter 46 is mostly just continuing some of the political stuff, mostly giving an idea to Rand's growing his following, growing his eyes as a legend in the eyes of all of his followers, whether they be Aiel or whoever else, like kind of submitting fealty to him, like the Terrans and the Carianan specifically. Like, yeah, cool political stuff, but that was the gist of what happened in that plot line over my reading over the week, which is, you know, really fun, really good stuff. Really enjoyed all of it, except for the fact that the duel with Kaladin was off page. Otherwise, the last 4 chapters that I read over the week, chapters 47 through 50, were coming to the conclusion of the Nynaeve and Elaine Tom Sandar plotline. So all of the circus plotline, essentially, which actually, yeah, that the circus plotline is completely concluded after chapter 48. So 47 and 48 is wrapping this stuff up, having another silly and frankly kind of dumb, slightly annoying argument between Nynaeve and Berget, which, this is like the only aspect of this plot line actually that I think like I actively have a problem with. But even then, it's been very minor. It hasn't affected my enjoyment of the plot line. It's just the fact that like I don't feel like the argument's been necessary. I feel like Berget is a little bit more obstinate than like she seemed like she was before she was, woke up in the real world. And then of course Nynaeve is slightly more also obstinate than I think she has been in the past. This goes along with what I heard of Nynaeve being at her worst and most annoying in this book. So if it's all up from here, that's actually really great, because she wasn't that bad in this book, in my opinion. And then there was, some other stuff with Elaine being a tad bit mature at the end of the chapter. Overall, looking forward to seeing these characters finally getting to Saladar. For now, it's mostly just in this chapter, just kind of being what it is in the circus. Nothing too notable actually happening, just the conversations, the interactions with the characters being less strong, I would say, in these couple of chapters. But chapter 48, called Leave Takings, as is classic for Robert Jordan when making a big change in the plot lines, we get the actual end to the circus plot line, which, nothing really too crazy to go on here. They aren't able to bring along certain people. They do bring along certain other people when they actually get to the ship that was purchased by Galad. Like I said, not really too much like happening to actually comment on, but I did enjoy the character interactions in chapter 48 as the circus plotline was wrapping up. And like I said, I think the hate for the circus plotline is greatly overblown. Just like the people who find like Nynaeve and Elaine like really annoying in this book versus other books, I think some of those criticisms are a little bit overblown. I did not have an issue with them. I've heard certain people say the circus plotline seems like it drags on forever and ever and ever, and it never stops. And it's like almost the entire time these girls have been involved with the circus, with the menagerie, has been spent in Tel'aran'rhiod, not in the circus. So like the Tel'aran'rhiod stuff is really good. So I don't see what people have been complaining about the whole time. But it is what it is. I enjoyed it enough. Chapters 49 and 50 were both really long chapters. I think they were drawn out just a little bit more than they needed to be. They didn't both need to be 20 pages. They could have been like 15 pages and it would have been better. Just taking the girls and actually getting this group of people to Saladar to finally meet up with the other Aes Sedai, the other Blue Aes Sedai, and whoever else is there, who, as we established in a previous diary probably like 2 weeks ago or something like that, that they're hoping to depose Elida. So, just kind of preparations going there, character interactions there. It was nice to get to see Min and Swan and Leanne again, but nothing too crazy happened. Just kind of more meshing these two plot lines together and setting them up for something, like I said, that I think will be really enjoyable for Lord of Chaos. But otherwise, nothing that I feel like I really need to note specifically and spoiler-wise with these two chapters. I liked the character interactions. I thought the chapters went on just a tiny bit longer than they needed to, but I thought they were a satisfactory resolution to this plot line. Especially when you consider that in the Shadow Rising, I think the Tanchico plotline, so the one with these characters, was really good, even though it seemed like it was only half done. You had the little skirmish between Nynaeve and Moghedien at the end of that one, and then other stuff with the Black Aja, so that stuff was complete, but there was still something that needed to happen with these girls here, and I guess most of it was just, coming back, trying to get back to the White Tower, discovering that the White Tower is in chaos now, and then making it back to this other secondary tower in name only, where all of the rest of the Aes Sedai have gathered. So this plot line is essentially resolved, and I'm happy for that. I'm glad to have a couple plot lines resolved at the end of this book, compared to the Shadow Rising, where I felt like even though the Tanchico plotline was resolved in what it was doing, it wasn't quite done yet, as I just mentioned. The Two Rivers plotline there was actually really good, really well done, resolved really well, and it hasn't been in this book at all, funny enough. But the Rand plotline I felt like was not resolved in very great ways. I thought the resolution of that one in The Shadow Rising was rather rushed, wasn't fully done, wasn't given the space that it needed to breathe, and it felt to me at the time like it came out of nowhere. I've had people try to tell me that it doesn't actually come out of nowhere. I don't care. It felt like it came out of nowhere to me. So like it didn't connect with that ending very much. And there was very obviously still stuff to be done with it. The fact that Kaladin revealed himself as this other he who comes with the dawn, that was, a trick for the Aiel set by Asmodean. Like this problem that needed to be solved, that led for the plotline to be completed in a more full way in this book. Which I guess saying that, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, because I do still have 80 pages left. I do still have 6 chapters left. I do still have a little bit more of this Rand plotline to go, doing whatever it is that it's going to do. But I am excited to figure out what that's going to be. So I'm going to stop rambling in this video and get to reading the book and actually finishing it over the next couple days. So I'm really excited about that. Here's hoping that it goes well, that the book ends well, and that I still really like it, and I'm, maybe even inclined to consider it my favorite book in the series when I review it. Hopefully sooner than later. We'll see what happens. But yeah, I'm gonna get out of your face now. Tune in again next week for the final Wheel of Time diary for the Fires of Heaven, and see what I thought about the ending, because I'm excited to find out what that is for sure.